Thank you everyone for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce Lydia Goehr. Lydia asked me to do a very short introduction because there's so that we have enough time for discussion. So, very short introduction. Lydia is a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. As most of you know, she's published widely on critical theory, aesthetics, in particular also the philosophy of music, written on Adorno and Dante. And today she will talk about painting in waiting, or prelude to a critical philosophy of history and art. Lydia? Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you. That's the program.
So I'm a bit jet-lagged. I only had about an hour and a half sleep, so I'm feeling a bit grouchy this morning. And then when they printed out my talk, they printed it in 8 points, so I can hardly read it. But I'll try and read the first paragraph, and then I'll give up. Okay. So I didn't know we were next to the Cervantes Institute before, but it's very relevant because I want to begin with an episode from Cervantes' last work, The Trial. I don't like this echoing effect of this. It's good. No, I prefer no mic at all.
Then in that case, it won't be on record.
That'd be better. Okay. Okay. So, anyway, I'm beginning with an episode from Cervantes' last work, The Trials of Persiles and Sigismunda of 1617. A pilgrim poet conversing with Periandro tells of a wealthy monsignor in Rome who has the most curious museum in the world. It's a museum of the future, comprising empty tablets awaiting illustrious persons worthy enough to be painted. 2 inscriptions give us a clue of such persons to come, specifically poets who through their works will justify the coming of a great political leader, in this case, Constantine. All the pronunciations I apologize for. One poet is named Toccato Tasso, the other Zarate. Anyone correct me in Spanish?
They're still asleep.
Okay. Tasso is named for his illusions or madness, a most Cervantian preoccupation. The other poet for his lack of talent. So something's clearly awry in this museum. Listening to the story, Periandro is duly skeptical. Isn't the preparing of the blank tablets a waste of the painter's time? Won't painters die of starvation, waiting for the poets? Will there ever be great figures in the future, as there have been in the past? After all, aren't we in Rome, where the museums are already filled with the greatest of the masterpieces? Couldn't the past teach us all we want to know? Perhaps even that the enduring masterpieces have testified to the greatness more of artists than of political leaders. And even if tablets in waiting were ever to be completed, wouldn't a museum of the future always demand new tablets to be produced? A museum of the future. It's beginning to sound like a contradiction in terms. Now, I'm recounting this story. I haven't done any justice to Cervantes' episode, but I don't care because that's not my point today. More pertinent is his suggestive use of the word tablos, to remind us that as far as a museum of the future is concerned, we could as much be thinking about books as about paintings, such as when we speak of the future as an open book, which even if framed or delimited by covers of the past and the present, finds its blank pages, waiting always to be filled in. My lecture this morning is about waiting for the future. It's more about waiting than it is about the future. After all, you can't say anything about the future. I'm interested in how waiting has been used in the arts and even as an aesthetic concept to bring truthfulness not only to living a human life, but also conceptually to philosophical method, and particularly to critical theory. At first, when exploring the idea of waiting, I thought I was going to be the first ever to have discussed such a concept, until I discovered that the word waiting and the thought of it is as old as the hills. I was really disappointed. It turns out everyone's talked about it. That's always the way it goes. But this morning I want to offer a constellation of thought images, literally Denkbilder, true to critical theory, to bring a different sort of attention to what already for centuries has gone by the term trumpery. Trumpism and trumpery was a concept actually worked out in the 18th century. It ain't anything new. Now, the kind of trumpery I'm interested in is a falseness or fakery of news, as everybody's been talking about, but produced by those who have exhibited every sort of failure to wait. Now, to exhibit every sort of failure to wait is quite a feat for a single individual. It's a spectacular failure, one that we can hardly fathom, or nowadays we can because we have a living president. It's a spectacular failure to wait. We've heard about Trumpism addressed by reference to the authoritarian personality, by the one-dimensional man, but my purpose is different. It's different. I want to pick up on the hubris of impatience in which waiting has always been offered as the philosophical antidote. Waiting, as far as critical theory is concerned, is the most difficult thing in the world. It's as difficult as living an emancipated life. It's as difficult as engaging in theory in a critical way. One cause of the difficulty in waiting turns on the phenomenology or hermeneutics of time, of the confusion we have with the past, the future, and the present, of their being all interconnected. All those books called Futures Past, Past Futures, blah, blah. You know, it's all very complicated. Another difficulty, I mean, blah, blah just means you know what I'm talking about. But it's my favorite term, actually. Another difficulty turns on the dialectic demanded of critical theory when we're instructed always to gesture towards a better future, an emancipated society, even a utopia, while yet we're also demanded to refuse any idea of an end being achieved or reached. Only if we refuse the end to be achieved do we keep the critical theory critical, because it allows the labor of the negative to continue. As I see it, the waiting game of critical theory is an almost impossible game, not only for Trump, but for all of us to play. If winning, or what Marty yesterday called triumphalism, is thought to be its end. What sort of game is a critical theory game, the waiting game? What sort of it, if it renders the failure to wait equal to the desire to win, and the refusal even to try to win, the only true way to wait? That is the most dialectical thing I will ever say in my life. It's on a par with Adorno, but that's the point. Now, I think I stop reading now. Okay. Oh, no, I can't quite yet. I have to say one other thing. Now, when Cervantes was engaging his little story about blank paintings, he was engaging a tabula rasa tradition, which you all know from philosophy of the 17th century, an extremely influential tradition. The unscribed tablets of Aristotle, the blank pages of Locke, the white pages of Locke, all these philosophers who asked in what the mind consists before experience? Does it indeed consist of anything before we have sensory experience? This tabula rasa tradition is really crucial. It's been used in all kinds of ways to question, to raise our epistemological questions. But it's also been used, interestingly, and I'm just showing you a few pictures associated with it, it's also been used to think about philosophical method, what it means to engage with a philosophical method, whether we find it with our beginning point in philosophical method to be presuppositionless or filled already with presuppositions. It's like the mind. When we begin to do philosophy, are we starting from an empty point, a null point, or are we already presupposing a lot of stuff going on? It's been held, the tabula rasa tradition was of course used by Descartes to produce the method of doubt, where in a mind filled with false thoughts, you have to get rid of them all and start again with an empty mind. So the tabula rasa tradition, used as a way of thinking about emptying the mind or the mind beginning empty, is one of the foundational motifs for thinking about philosophical method. It's similarly been used, and this is what I'm interested in the history of art, with all kinds of blank paintings. You see them with Robert Flood in the 17th century, all these blank things. This is a famous painting facing backwards. Here's a tablet on a pedestal with a palette of paints where nothing is painted, already in the 17th century. So whatever you think about the modern history of monochrome painting, it was already thought through in the 16th and 17th centuries. Most of what we think in modernism already has a prior history. I think that's important, of course, for us to know. One of the things we want to know about this painting, and this is why I'm so interested in this problem, is that when these people are painted in profile, there's a suggestion that the picturing and the blank tablets which they're holding and pointing towards don't tell us all. We want the idea of blankness to capture what in a Denkbild, or a thought image in critical theory, both shows you and conceals. There's an element of concealing in this profile painting. And that's what I'm interested in most of all today. I want to ask what it is about picturing blank tablets or picturing nothing that clues us into the nature of critical theory, what it means for the theory to be critical. And we know this very well if we remember Kierkegaard's or Kierkegaard, because we're in Scandinavia, Kierkegaard's epigraph for his stages on life's way, where he writes, works of philosophy as much as works of art are mirrors, sind Spiegel. If an ape looks in, no apostle can look out. He uses this apish gaze to allude to the passage in Corinthians, which you all know, wherein when we encounter ourselves, we see through a glass darkly. One of Adorno's favorite motifs also. The darkness corresponds to what this term speculum for the mirror, but in enigmata, is an enigmatic mirror. So to gaze into a dark mirror or into a blank tablet is to refuse that all mimesis is direct or transparent, that with every assertion of something, putting forward of something, something else is concealed. So Adorno and Horkheimer write in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, in taking fright at the image in its own mirror, the thought opens to a view to what lies beyond it. This interesting idea of a mirror being enigmatic. Now, all of this was just a prelude to get to what I really want to deal with today. And this is a single paragraph from Habermas, from an interview he did with Michael Haller in 1991 in their book Vergangenheit als Zukunft. the past as future. So I'm just going to read this. I think I can walk away now. I've given it in German. I'm only interested in one line, but we're going to read it because it's kind of interesting. The emancipated society is in fact an ideal that suggests misunderstandings. By the way, I retranslated it because Max Penske's translation missed out some of the key words. So, as good as he is, I like Max very much, but he got one thing wrong. So he says, I prefer to speak of the idea of the uninjured, undamaged into subjectivity. This idea can generally be derived or won from the analysis of necessary conditions for communication, for reaching an understanding consensus. I'm giving you alternate translations. It signifies something like the appearance of symmetrical relations of a free, reciprocal recognition amongst communicatively acting subjects. That's like basic Habermas 101. Then he writes, of course, allerdings, this idea must not be ausgemalt into the totality of a reconciled form of life and thrown or cast into the future as utopia. That's a sentence from my Vortrag, my lecture. It contains nothing more, he says, but also nothing less than the formal characterization of necessary conditions for the not anticipatable forms of non-damaged life, or a life that is not a failure or does not miss its mark or not in error or not misled. Socialism, likewise, as a term or ideal, ought never, and this might well be the greatest philosophical mistake of this tradition, to have been conceived of as a concrete whole of a determinate future form of life. I have always said against this. Socialism is useful only for referring to the quintessence or epitome of necessary conditions for emancipated forms, in the plural, of life, about which the participants themselves would have to reach an agreement. Okay, so there's much in this passage of interest, whether the term socialism has any use for us today. What term could we replace it with? That's a terribly anxious question for us all. I'm actually more interested in the use of Habermas's negating terms, the not anticipatable, the not damaged life, and so on, because this clearly harks back to Adorno's founding image for critical theory of a damaged life lived at so catastrophic a moment that he could declare the life not lived at all, das Leben lebt nicht. With Adorno, Habermas has no inclination to turn the negative into an empty or dead positive, and mostly because he has in mind what Hegel long ago declared the greatest philosophical error, when an ideal of a better future is turned away from history to be rendered a timeless and a priori ideal, or when, according to the terms of what he called his einseitig monochromatisch Formalismus, one-sided monochromatic formalism, one speaks wrongly of the night in which all cows are black. And as you might know, Adorno repeated this little trope at least 15 times. And never once did he refer to the cows that are black. He chose rather the cats that are grey. And I've written a whole chapter on that little transition between black cows and grey cats. It's all very domestic and interesting, and so on. Anyway, to avoid the greatest philosophical error, Habermas employed negating terms in accordance with the primary conviction of critical theory, that to work through the past in the present for the sake of a better future, one must avoid assuming the conceit that the future could ever be ausgemalt. Now, he took this idea straight from Hegel, the idea of not ausmalen the future. I'm not translating it for a reason. Hegel used this term very specifically, you all know where, at the end of the Vorrede to the Philosophy of Right. And he did this to capture, he uses the word ausmalen or ausgemalt. It's an incredibly complex term. Here's a range of all the meanings it can have, and I just want to point them out. It can mean blazoning, crayoning, coloring, amplifying, envisioning, imagining, picturing, maybe even painting. And the interesting thing here is why use a term from art history to address something about philosophical method. And what you know from the Vorrede is this. Hegel's one of his most famous sentences, that in the matter of emancipating both life and thought, in the transition from servitude to freedom, in the movement from thinking in error to thinking correctly, or finally now for Hegel, in the transition from one life form, Lebensform, to another, philosophy always comes too spät, always comes too late, and thus paints the life form, he says, that is receding into the past as a Vergangenes, mit Grau in Grau. In the gathering grey twilight, as the clouds form, the owl of Minerva begins its flight, though we have no idea where the owl flies, the nature of the flight, but we know that it can never meet Kant's dove that flies too high into this airless a priori space. All we know is that philosophy is painting mit its, he says, with its Grau in Grau. Hegel repeats that phrase, that philosophy does not produce a picture. The Ausgemalt is not to produce a picture. Philosophy doesn't paint the form of life as a picture. He rather uses this expression to say that the previous form of life can never be rejuvenated, from verjüngen. So whatever philosophy does, its limits on picturing are affirmed, leaving a new form of life, a new history to begin, seemingly without philosophy. Now, everybody has discussed this little bit of Hegel. You know, there are lots of Hegel scholars. But I'm only interested in the phrasing mit Grau in Grau. It's being a fascinating phrase taken from the history of monochromatic painting before painting was actually known as the monochrome. Mit Grau in Grau was how you painted paintings with a single color, whichever color it was. It's a fascinating term. Why Hegel used mit Grau in Grau is quite different from Goethe's declaration in Faust that alle Tiere ist grau. Why didn't Hegel say it paints in grau? Why mit Grau in Grau? Why use this art historical term? So that's one question. Let's go back to Habermas now, just to consider this again, and to note about Habermas' sentence here. Why does he say, of course, allerdings? Why does he say, of course? When you say of course, you're saying something that feels to you really self-evident, right? But if it's so evident, so self-evident, why do you have to say it? Why repeat it that the idea must not be painted or pictured? So this is my question today for you. Why is it that so many people, and especially critical theorists, insisted that the future not be painted or not be pictured? Why did they use the terms of pictoriality? Why did they use the term from the arts to tell us what could not be claimed about the future? And I think the answer is fairly easy, that those people who make a claim on the future are normally sophists, Trumpites, yeah? They make a claim. But then again, we know that there's been an incredible history of people painting Nachleben, heavens and hells, epic poets reaching paradise, gained after losing it for a while, and so on. We know that there's lots of art and poetry about the future. So why the claim that the future not be painted? That's my question. Why insist on this claim over and over again? It can't be because of the obvious epistemological limitation that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. That would be really boring. They're clearly insisting because they want to defeat a certain kind of conceit or hubris. The danger of people who make a claim on the future, like our promises that tomorrow is going to be great, fantastic, says our president every day. Your president, I'm not an American, thank God. Right. Oh, wait a minute, I'm on tape, I'm never going to, they won't allow me back. But they make a claim on the future, and their fantasy or imagining, from Ausmalen, their imagining, their fiction, is confused with reality. We are scared of the capacity of our imaginations to imagine something which we then claim has actually come about. That's really the fakery of fake news, right? You just say this is what's going to happen. So the critical theorists insist on standing back, not getting far enough. And Habermas does it by one ingenious sentence. It contains nothing more, but also nothing less than the formal characterization of necessary conditions, of the not anticipatable. Think of it this way, that the task of philosophy has always been to set out necessary conditions that could then become, in what Horkheimer calls traditional theory, positivism, a sufficient condition. So that if you specified the necessary conditions, you would get to a sufficiency, and you get the whole picture. But if you claim only ever to lay down necessary conditions and refuse the necessity of those conditions to lead to a sufficiency, then you're always stopping short of reaching the end goal. And this is what Habermas and other critical theorists, I now want to say, capture in the sense of waiting, of not getting as far as they want to go. So I'm interested in prioritizing the idea of waiting in critical theory. Nietzsche wrote about waiting, Kierkegaard wrote about waiting. All the philosophers who were interested in the arts, by the way, and took the arts seriously, and the aesthetic concept seriously, introduced waiting into their claims about critical theory. I think that when you don't wait, you turn critical theory back into traditional theory. So what does waiting mean? That's a very simple question. And how has waiting become worked out in terms of picturing? Does waiting give any of you any clues about what I'm going to be talking about next? Waiting for? Waiting for the promised land, for Moses. I've just written a book about Moses, this is why. Right. Waiting for the promised land, what Nietzsche called the preluding, preparation, Moses, Socrates, waiting, preparing, but not arriving. What you spoke about yesterday as using your imagination to take a journey to work out things with Hannah Arendt. Looking for, but not finding, searching, seeking, yearning, preluding, never getting past the prelude, preparation, not reaching the end point. Philosophy's task is to stay in this space of waiting. People like Fichte, Feuerbach, Wagner talked about artwork, society, religion of the future. And they showed an inability to wait, an impatience, a claim that they could produce a picture of the future. And they were criticized by Nietzsche for that conceit, that one needed to hold back and stop. How do you picture waiting? What color does it come? Mostly it comes in a grey room, doesn't it? Why a grey room? Do you know what I'm talking about? Waiting for, warten auf. Who am I talking about? Godot, Beckett, right. The space of waiting is not actually waiting for Godot. It is that partly. It's Endspiel, where the whole thesis of waiting is given formulation. Waiting in this room, in Beckett's play, is a space where the walls contain what we call these Denkbilder, which are always contradictory images. Everything that is claimed, put forward, is withdrawn. Every communication of meaning is taken away. Every word uttered is pulled back. Waiting is this dialectical space. And my thought is really about critical theory is that almost nobody in critical theory nowadays waits. We've turned critical theory into theory, and we've forgot the critique because we've become impatient. We talk a lot about the labor of the negative, of negation, but we don't use it. And partly why we don't use it is because we're unwilling to employ all the concepts, the aesthetic concepts that have been used to capture this sense of waiting, which cannot be described. When Kierkegaard tried to describe it, he always drew on the arts. When Nietzsche described it, he always drew on the arts. When Adorno addressed waiting, he always used motifs, aesthetic concepts from the arts. And if you give up on the aesthetic concepts, I don't believe you can really do critical theory. So there's my challenge to you, for all of you who don't do aesthetics. You've got to have those aesthetic concepts. They're the ones that do the work, really, of critique, because they allow us to remain in the waiting game. No, but he lays this down with an of course, and he uses this. No, I don't in Habermas. In fact, I don't in most critical theorists. I think only Adorno really engages that waiting game. I just wanted to give you a couple of more thoughts, and then you can shout at me. Okay. What I'm interested in, as I told you, is the idea of thinking about critical theory through a particular aesthetic concept today. And that one of the concepts is waiting, and the other is picturing. And I want to know, how do you picture the space of waiting? Does the Mitgrau and Grau help us think about what it means to be in this waiting game? Shall I just show you a clip from Beckett, and then you'll see what the hell I'm talking about? Here's some nice Adorno sentences and Kierkegaard. Here. Look at the end game, the stage instructions, just for the Endspiel, end game. It says, bare interior, grey light, left and right back, 2 small windows, curtains drawn, right front, a door. Hanging near door, its face to a wall, a picture. Front left touching each other, ash bins. Notice the inversion of the instructions. Front right to door, hanging near door, its face to wall, a picture, not a picture hanging backwards to the wall, but the inversion of instructions. And then Beckett saying, any production of endgame which ignores my stage directions is completely unacceptable to me. My play requires an empty room and 2 small windows. And we know that when they look out the windows with the telescope, they see a horizon which becomes the interior of the room. So the walls. But we've got a grey room. We have Clove with a very red face, referring back to the red-faced shame of Achilles, looking over the horizon in the wine-dark sea of Homer. Let me just play you a clip here. I think it might come. Please start talking.
The stillness. If I can hold my peace and sit quiet, it will be.
Oh, whoops. Shit. Sorry. Excuse my language.
The stillness. If I can hold my peace and sit quiet, it will be all over with sound and motion and all over and done with. I'd have called my father, and I'd have called my son, even twice or three times in case they shouldn't have heard me the first time or the second. I'll say to myself, he'll come back. And then, he couldn't. He's gone too far. And then, all kinds of fantasies. Then I'm being watched. A rat. Steps. Breath held, and then babble. Words like the solitary child who turns himself into children. 2, 3, so as to be together and whisper together in the dark. Moment upon moment, pattered down like the millet grains of that old Greek. And all life long, you wait for that to mount up to a life. Let's get it over.
I'm going to turn it off just because I've got so little time. Certainly no future. All my life when I've done my work, I've always looked for some tiny little passing allusion, some reference to something in a philosophical text, the use of a particular term, like Ausgemalt, for example, or a use of a particular example, and then have tried to read the theory through this particular concept. So you could read Adorno, as I've done, through the concept of Bewegung, and with all the rhythm and musical content. But today I decided to do it through the way in which he uses picturing terms, and the way he picks up in Beckett on the picturing on the grey space. Adorno makes a claim about Beckett's play that all the wit that you find in Molière in the 17th, 16th and 17th centuries he says, been sucked out of the marrow bone. And what kind of wit are we talking about? There's one kind of wit that has gone through the history of philosophy and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, Adorno. Going back to Socrates, it's called the wit of inversion. We know it when you turn things head over foot in German idealism and Goethe. We know that image. But there's a wit of inversion where pictures have been turned on their side, or inside out, or upside down, all kinds of examples, or back to front, to make a claim on philosophical method. And this is what I'm interested in most, in the way in which this picturing put on its side, into profile, inside out, turned upside down. I've got lots of examples, but no time to show you them all, have been used to make a claim on philosophical method. And my question is, again, why is it that you need to appeal to picturing or to rhythm or to musical terms to make the claim on method? We know to capture something. And when I think Adorno spoke of something being lost in contemporary life or in critical theory, especially for him in the way that he did it, I think what was lost was this wit of inversion, generally a wit overall, and generally the aesthetic concepts, because theory, as you know from the negative dialectic, is always tempted to remove all its aesthetic, mimetic, unconscious forces that he puts into aesthetic theory and to turn it into traditional theory. And so my question again is, why in critical theory do we have to retain these allusions to the arts and to aesthetics to make a claim on philosophical theory? Why could we do it without that? And even more controversially, could we capture the requisite negativity or negation, labor of the negative that we need in critical theory if we don't make reference to the arts? What do the arts have that philosophy is missing? The concept of form. How do you read Adorno? By taking form seriously and not merely what he says, the how he says it. And if you just think of the first lines of the aesthetic theory and the first lines of the negative dialectic, you know that the form of these sentences are always these dialectical thought images in Adorno. Makes him impossible to read. But why does he offer those kinds of sentences to us? What does he want us not to do? So I'm trying to say that critical theory is a really difficult game to play. And most of us can't hold on to the actual critique. I mean, I say that, and partly it's a desire just to spell it out in normal, traditional, theoretical terms. That's enough. I mean, I've got more to say, but that'll do. Okay.